Let's go now to a pretty thrilling documentary, I have to say. It's called The Most Dangerous Man in America, a film which focuses on the man who released the Pentagon Papers to the media back in 1971. His name was Daniel Ellsberg, a Defense Department and White House consultant. The film was nominated for an Academy Award at this year's Oscars.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, the top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments.
I think it is time in this country to quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspaper.
In the first year of marriage, we're talking about him going to prison for the rest of his life.
Now, girls, forgive me concerned about the possibility of going to prison for this.
We have a quick back. Wouldn't you go to prison to tell son this war?
We felt so strongly that we were dealing with a national security crisis. Henry Kissinger said that Dr. Daniel Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America, and he had to be stopped.
In exposing top-secret documents, President Richard Nixon said that Ellsberg was placing himself above everybody else, including the President and the Congress. And although he faced numerous charges under the US Espionage Act, in the end Daniel Ellsberg avoided jail. But it was never his intention to do more than to try to bring about an end to the war in Vietnam. These papers set events in motion which led to the eventual fall of President Richard Nixon. Judith Ehrlich is the filmmaker. There's a documentary on show at this week's Sydney Film Festival. Judith, welcome to Breakfast.
Thank you very much.
Daniel Ellsberg was a self-described true believer. He was working inside the Pentagon on the Vietnam War. He even, well, not quite signed up, but even went and fought on the front line in Vietnam. He knew intimately how the war was progressing. What was his intention when he decided to not just hand over but publish the Pentagon Papers?
Well, Daniel Ellsberg had been a Marine commander. He was very much committed to the American Cold War and had a transformation, both a spiritual and political transformation, because of his because of his exposure to war resistors and to Gandhiists, who he got to know. And really at the point when he made that decision, as he says in the film, and says his life split in two. That the person who he had been, this cold warrior, he now saw his patriotism as a patriotism to the Constitution, rather to his boss, the president. And I think he really felt that he responded to a higher good, which was really a belief in nonviolence versus violence, and that he didn't want to be part of that war-making machine. He wanted to be part of peacemaking.
I was beginning to realize we couldn't beat this enemy in their own backyard. We were not going to win. These guys were not going to give up. On the way back, which was on McNamara's plane, I'd had the chance to give him more than 100 single-spaced pages of my memos. He sat there and he hadn't apparently brought a lot to read. And I had the great bureaucratic pleasure of watching my superior actually read my papers and not just toss them aside. So he knew what I was thinking very much about the stalemate in Vietnam and the fact that things weren't improving. Toward the end of the flight, he called me to the rear of the plane. Dan, I'm having an argument here. He says that things are improving, that we're making progress. And I say things are worse than they were a year ago. You're the one who knows. What do you say the answer is? I said, well, Mr. Secretary, I'm most impressed with how much the same things are than a year ago. And he said, see, that's exactly what I'm saying. We've put another 100,000 troops in there. Things are no better. That means they're really worse. We were on the ground, and McNamara was going out into a foggy day, and I was behind him.
You asked whether I was optimistic or pessimistic. Today I can tell you that military progress in the past 12 months has exceeded our expectations.
He was saying, gentlemen, I'm very encouraged by what I've seen in Vietnam. In every respect, things are better now. We're making progress. Everything is better. And I was thinking, I hope I'm never in a job where I have to lie like that.
Then he started to leak papers, not the whole Pentagon Papers initially. When he decides that the Pentagon Papers need to be published, the anti-war members of Congress aren't that interested. The newspapers are worried about publishing state secrets. He actually had a hard job getting the word out, didn't he?
Absolutely. A year and a half of pounding on doors in Congress where he thought he was going to get a good reception. I mean, Dan Ellsberg had written some of this report. He was only one of 3 people who read the entire 7,000-page report, which was on the history of American involvement in Vietnam. He thought he knew the Congress had the right to that report, but no one wanted to touch it. It was just too hot for the Congress to touch. So he eventually went to the New York Times and found an ally there who was willing to spend months of research and writing, and the Times.
And I found it quite sad, really, to realise that after publication, and Ellsberg was disappointed in this, it seemed to have little impact on public opinion.
Well, it's interesting because I think looking back on it now, he sees that quite differently. But there was a moment when Dan, who has a tremendous amount of faith in the power of the word and the power of documents, felt that when the American people, it did have a tremendous impact at the time on public opinion. It was just that he expected it to end the war right then, and it certainly didn't do that. But it did change it opened a crack in the curtain of secrecy, and it allowed Americans to understand that they'd been lied to about the war and see it differently.
And President Richard Nixon knew that. He could see that coming. Let's just play another grab from the film, Nixon's response on the Pentagon tapes.
Just because some guy's going to be a martyr, we can't be in a position of allowing the fellow to get away with this kind of wholesale thievery, or otherwise it's going to happen all over the government. I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
And they tried, and they nearly did, but they failed.
They failed because of a lot of synchronicity and luck on Dan's part, basically. The fact that John Dean, who's one of the characters in our film who we interviewed, John Dean released information about that was very relevant to Dan's case in Washington and the Watergate hearings at the same time as Dan's trial in Los Angeles. The judge was bribed by President Nixon. A lot of things happened that were really beyond Dan's control. There was every possibility he would have gone to prison for 115 years. It was a lot of real luck that he didn't end up going to prison.
How do you see the legacy of the Pentagon Papers? Obviously, it had a legacy on the Supreme Court, had a legacy on perhaps the awareness, if you like, of the commentariat in the United States. But more broadly, it's still going on. People leaking state secrets because of what they regard is the greater good. We have a case at the moment, an American soldier who reportedly passed secret video of a US Army helicopter attack in Iraq that we've all seen on the WikiLeaks site. He says that he passed all these state secrets because he'd come across documents that contained, quote, incredible things, awful things that belonged in the public domain.
I think this is a question it's a very basic question of the people's right to know versus national security. And I think in Dan's particular case, he was an expert in security. He knew he wasn't leaking anything that had any danger to American security. I think that there's a tradition of whistleblowing that's a really important tradition of people who in positions of authority or more positions of knowing have the courage to release information that they feel that the people of the United States or Australia or wherever they happen to be have the right to know. And I think that that's an important precedent. Dan has been arrested 79 times for civil disobedience since the Pentagon Papers. He turned a corner and never went back. He's become a lifelong peace activist, really dedicating his life to try to change war making and certainly to stop nuclear war.
And he's alive. And he's a contributor to this documentary, and his opinions, as you say, are still there. And he's a changed man, really, from the man who strode through those fields in Vietnam. Judith, it's a wonderful film. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Judith Ehrlich and her film, The Most Dangerous Man in America. It's going to be screened at the Sydney Film Festival tomorrow night, the 10th of June. And she's going to give us a talk before the film, and it really is a fantastic documentary.